My name is Louise Middleton. I'm a region lead here at Outback Futures, and we're an organisation which is all about walking alongside communities in rural and remote in that area of mental health and wellbeing. With me here from our Outback Futures clinical team is Jo Stevens, one of our counsellors. Hey Jo, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure, Louise. I've been working with Outback Futures for over a year now. I work as a counsellor in Central West and Northwest parts of Queensland. Before I was a counsellor, I used to be a registered nurse and a paramedic, so I do have some understanding of supporting people who are self-harming.
Thanks, Jo. And I guess as both of us are parents, we're invested in that space as well. It's always so good to be as equipped as we can be to have greater awareness about these sorts of things.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So what can you expect from this session? Jo and I sat down with a couple of our colleagues, Mary and Margot, just recently to have a bit of a broader discussion about self-harm. And that's what we're going to share with you now. And after that, you'll come back to Jo and I and we'll attempt to answer any questions that you might have before we finish up. So I guess one thing to just flag as you watch, if you do have any questions, please write them in the chat. And you can also opt for those to be anonymous if you would like. And we'll do our best to answer those at the end. Is there anything else that you'd like to flag, Jo?
Oh yeah, I just think if anyone's sort of listening and it's bringing up some things for them, we're going to have a slide that'll come up where people can contact us. And I guess you and I are going to Baku tomorrow. So if anyone wanted to catch up with us sort of face-to-face or by phone or other means, they can certainly do that. So the slide that we'll put up a bit later, we'll have those details, so email, our website and also a phone number.
Thanks, Jo. Today we're talking about the topic of self-harm, and I have three clinicians from the team at Outback Futures joining me. We have Margot, who is a psychologist, and Jo and Mary, who are counsellors, and I think between the three of them they represent all the regions that we work in at Outback Futures. So let's start with the basics. Margot, could you give us a quick overview of what self-harm is?
Of course. So self-harm, the ways in which a person can self-harm can vary greatly, but usually involves any sort of behaviour where the person is trying to cause deliberate intent or injury to themselves. So that can include things like cutting or scratching, burning or picking the skin, banging or punching objects on themselves, pulling out their hair, intentionally overdosing on drugs or medication or self-poisoning, or deliberate risk-taking with the intention of injury. So for example, things like driving at really high speeds or using farm machinery a bit recklessly, all those sorts of things can include self-harm.
Okay. I feel like we hear a lot more about self-harm these days than previously. How prevalent is it?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to estimate the true number because we know particularly with teenagers, often they might hide their self-harm. But approximately 1 in 10 Australian teenagers are likely to have self-harmed at some point in their life.
And I guess one of the concern that many of us have as trusted adults in that space is whether there's actually a link between self-harm and suicide.
Yeah, and that can be a really tricky question to answer because we know people who have attempted suicide may have engaged in some sort of self-harming behaviour in the past. But it's really important to know that the intent behind self-harming behaviours and suicide are very different. And so understanding why your young person is self-harming may sort of give you a bit better of an idea of whether to keep an eye on any sort of suicide attempts. But I guess bottom line is they are linked, but not always. Self-harming doesn't always lead to suicide attempts.
Okay. So, Mary, would you be able to expand and help us understand what are some of the reasons why someone might self-harm?
Definitely. So, unfortunately, there are different reasons for different people. There's no set of reasons for self-harming. But the reasons can include things like the teen trying to escape unbearable distress, coping with overwhelming emotions, showing their distress to others, and sometimes it's even to punish themselves, which can even arise from past traumas. Sometimes it's even for them to actually feel something, because these teens can often feel very, very little. So they'll actually self-harm when they feel numb inside. And it can actually be a habit or a compulsive behavior. Sometimes it can actually be a symptom, though, of underlying mental health conditions.
Yeah, okay. And obviously all of those reasons are pretty distressing for our young people. What might be going on in their body and brain when someone does self-harm? Margot, would you be able to expand on that?
Yeah, of course. So similar to the reasons why someone might self-harm, what they experience when they self-harm can also vary greatly. So some people have reported experiencing a release in that self-harm can make all the bad things they're experiencing go away. Other people share that they might use self-harm to help control difficult feelings. So feelings like desperation, frustration, anxiety, depression, trauma and pain, self-harm can help them feel in control of those. Other people have shared that self-harm can represent unaccepted feelings. So for those that might struggle to find words for how they're feeling or to assert themselves or even to struggle to express how they're feeling, self-harm can help them do that. But it can also be a way for them to let others know that they need help and sort of a way to get that help from others. For some of our teenagers, they might use self-harm to connect with others and explore their self-identity. So particularly as a teenager, when there's a lot of importance, or they feel that there's a lot of importance to find a group or find their people, self-harming can be a bit of a way for them to connect with groups of people.
Okay. So if we do suspect someone self-harming, it's obviously quite a shock, and it's certainly very worrying and even scary for a trusted adult in that space. And it's actually quite hard for us to know how best to respond if we do suspect or know for sure that someone is self-harming. So what advice, what tips do you have to help us to know what to do? Jo, would you be able to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. And you're right, Louise. Feeling a range of emotions is really normal for parents and carers. So the types of emotions someone might feel could be a range of things like shock, anger, disappointment, feeling guilty, and panicked is another one that comes to mind. So if you're able to just keep yourself as calm as possible, the things that you might consider doing include remaining calm, focus on supporting your person to find the kind of coping strategies that they need. And you might also think about getting them the help that they need. Try to be supportive and non-judgmental and encourage them to seek help. And you might even suggest some options, but they may not take that up. So keep that in mind. Definitely some of the don'ts include considering, the panicking kind of emotion. Try and keep yourself nice and calm. Don't reject the person or ignore the problem, because it's really important that people know they're being listened to. Don't condone the self-harm. Don't give ultimatums. And even if you're trying to help someone, they may not want your help. So try and be supportive and considerate in the way that you offer that. I think that's really important, and they're probably the main things to consider.
Yeah, okay. So it really is taking that listening stance and just really being a safe person and a safe space for someone to open up if and when they're ready in that space. Yeah. So I guess a lot of your do's revolve around us having conversations with our teens, and we know that self-harm definitely isn't something that we should just ignore or hope will go away, as you've just said. But I think most of us can probably recognise the fact that sometimes it's really hard to start those conversations, especially with our teens. So do you have some advice and some useful ways that we can actually talk about self-harm? Mary, would you be able to speak to that?
Yes, Louise, you're right, Louise. Sometimes talking with our teens, particularly about the hard topics, is really difficult. But I would say don't be afraid to ask questions about self-harm with your teen. Bear in mind, though, that they may feel ashamed and they may be concerned about others finding out, particularly if they're in a small community. and try, as Joe said earlier, to stay calm, be non-judgmental, and listen silently without interrupting. I do have some conversation starters that might be a help. So you could say something to your teen like, I noticed some scars on your arms. I hope it's okay to say that. Can you tell me about what's happened or why they're there? I can see that you're very upset. You might be scared, but I'm scared too. It's very important for your teen to know that you don't have all the solutions, that you are scared as well, but together we can work this out. I think that's very important to give that line to your teenager. And the fact that you're self-harming tells me that you're very upset. You might not like the fact that I found out. I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions, but I do want to help when you're ready. And that's a very important key, is when they're ready.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, Mary. Thank you for that. So what do we actually do, though, if we actually find our teen injured or in an emergency situation? And Joe, maybe you could speak to that. I know in a previous life you were a paramedic.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to always know to call 000 and ask for an ambulance specifically. Even if you live out of town, they will always be there to answer your call, and they can step you through things. Even if you are someone that feels quite panicked, they can sort of talk you down and get you through the process. It's important also while you're on the phone, especially if you have someone else with you, to be thinking about some first aid treatment. So if you haven't done a first aid course for a while, now's a good time. It's a nice reminder. And you might be, dressing wounds and that kind of thing. So important to do that as well. It's important to ask the question if the young person is feeling suicidal. And I know people don't like to ask those questions. Doesn't mean because you're asking it that someone's going to go ahead and attempt suicide or complete suicide. It gives you a bit of a gauge, I guess. And if you have those concerns, call 000 or you can contact your hospital and talk with a mental health clinician, a mental health nurse. Another thing to be aware of is that someone may feel like they're at risk, but that risk can change over time. So sometimes they don't feel like they're at high risk, and other times they might feel at high risk. So it's just important to check in with them and ask how they're feeling. So I think that's probably the main things I think are important to think about.
That's really helpful. And I guess as I think about many of the regions that we work in and our bush families, teens are often away at boarding school, so they're actually gone for long periods of time. And parents don't have that connection all the time with their kids. So in that sort of an instance, what things should sort of parents, carers, a trusted adult of kids in boarding school be aware of? Mary, would you be able to speak to that? I know you were a principal previously.
Yes. You're right, Louise. It can be very tricky, particularly when your teenager is away from you. However, I would say keeping up regular interactions, preferably by FaceTime if you can often help to identify changes in behavior, emotions, and attitudes. Often looking at what they're not saying rather than actually what they are saying can be a good indication too. If you're really concerned, talk with boarding staff, because remember that the staff at the school have a duty of care for your child while they're in their care. Work with the school on strategies that are available. And if it really gets tough, consider taking your child out of school, maybe for a term or for a couple of weeks of a term, just to see. It's also useful if you do happen to have a close friend that lives nearby the school who you can trust. Maybe having them as a third party can often be good. They might be able to go and visit your child, for example. And then finding support options. Often it might be easier when your child is away in boarding school to refer to local agencies that may be there.
Yeah, fair enough. That makes complete sense. And I guess thinking about ourselves as the trusted adult in that space, parents as carers, we so often naturally put the needs of others above our own. But it's really important too, isn't it, for us to take care of ourselves and our own mental health in that space so that we can continue to look after others. So obviously there's self-care. That's one great way to specific steps to do. But what other things should parents and carers be doing in that space? Jo, maybe you could help us in that.
Yeah, I think sometimes people don't reach out for help for themselves. They'll reach out for help for the young person, but not for themselves. So I think it's really important. Yeah, really important to know who's in your inner circle. So it could be, you know, your partner. It could be a really close family member, your parent or, you know, sister, brother. And it also could just be a great friend. So you need to be thinking about who's there for you. Of course, there's always psychologists and counsellors, of which, you know, because we're doing this in our regions, that's us, and we understand self-harm and the concerns that someone might have for their young person. So we're people that can be accessed as well. And working with some other families I know who have gone through similar things, they may consider peer support. So I know that there's online groups that people might consider. There's other things like talking to your GP. Is an obvious one if you have one in your town. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And then just things like you talked about self-care, Louise. So things that you can do for you. So it might be going for a walk. It might be spending some time with the dog. Just simple things, simple pleasures of having a cup of tea to just reflect and think about things. I think that's really important because if we're not full, our cup isn't full, it's very hard for us to care for other people.
That's so true. And I guess the other thing I just want to mention quickly as I think about this, it's a really complex topic, as we've already mentioned, and there's an awful lot of resources out there. So what's your advice in that space too, Jo?
Yeah, we have a lot of online resources that we can provide from Outback Futures. There are a lot of 24/7 you know, places to connect. So the things that come to mind are Lifeline. They're always available 24/7. There's a parent line as well for parents, and there's also kids helpline as well. And I do have a number of friends that work in those two places, and they're wonderful people. So there's always help there. No one is on their own. I think that's important. But we've got those resources available for people as well.
Fantastic. That's great to know. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. We're actually now going to show a video from Headspace, which is on self-harm, and really it works to bring all that information that we've just been discussing together really well, and hopefully you'll find it really helpful. Thank you.
Well, in the beginning, I didn't really cut myself that much. But every time I did, it seemed to make me feel better. I don't know why, really. I guess it was a bit of a relief. So I kept doing it. You know, the more upset I would get about my dad not being around or stuff at school, the more I would do it. And then pretty soon I was doing it almost every day. I hid it from everyone, even my best friend Lucy.
One day when she pulled up her sleeves, I saw her cuts. She didn't realise I'd seen them. I knew she was stressed, but cutting herself? I never would have thought she'd do that. I didn't say anything to anyone. I was worried Alyssa would be angry at me if I did.
Well, as a mother, you don't want to think that your child is unhappy. But I knew something wasn't right. She was becoming withdrawn and her behaviour was going downhill. And her attitude was becoming so negative. Anyway, it was around then that I noticed that she had some marks on her forearm, and I knew that was a real problem. I kept trying to talk to her about it, and she'd just come up with these little excuses. Or she'd get really angry and just tell me to back off. And then I'd get really, really frustrated, and then out of desperation one day I just came out with it. I said, "Have you been cutting yourself? Is that why you've got these scars on your arms?" Tears started rolling down her cheeks. I think she was ashamed that I knew.
Mum was so good to talk to. She didn't make me feel stupid, she just sat and listened. Once Mum knew, I felt I could tell Lucy. And it turned out she already knew. I was so surprised. A few days later, Mum booked me in to see a counsellor. I didn't really want to go at first, but I thought I would give it a try. Partly just to get her off my back, but I also knew I needed to get some help.
When Alyssa first came to see me, she was pretty uncomfortable, but that's not unusual. Talking about what's going on with someone you don't know can feel a bit strange at first, but after a while she would begin to say more, ask more questions, and I guess become a bit curious about how things could be different for her, how she could actually give up cutting. Knowing that our sessions were confidential also helped her to open up. But because self-harm was involved, we did have a discussion early on about ensuring Alyssa stayed safe. And if I was concerned that she was at risk of serious harm, then she knew that I would need to talk to someone about it in order to keep her safe. Alyssa's cuts weren't deep and didn't require medical attention, but I needed to know that she was looking after them and knew what to do.
It took me a few sessions to actually start telling her stuff. But she wasn't shocked or surprised when I started talking about my cutting. In fact, she asked me lots of questions about it. She gave me some ideas of what else might help, like writing down my thoughts when I'm feeling stressed, or even just getting out of the house makes a difference. And now that I've told my mum, just talking to her really helps.
I found these sites which talk about how to help a friend who was self-harming. It's not just about telling her to stop. It's more about being there to listen when she gets stressed and making sure just to do normal stuff together.
I've really seen Alyssa change over the last few months, and I'm beginning to understand more how it all works, why Alyssa gets stressed and what makes her cut. I think the big thing for me, though, is how I can help her. If she feels overwhelmed, I just try to do things with her, even simple things like go to the movies or, go for walks. I mean, Alyssa's got a long way to go, but she's on the right track and I'm really proud of her. She knows that she can't do it on her own, but she's working really hard at it and that takes courage. I'm really hopeful about her future now.
Alyssa is much more aware of her thinking and the impact this has on her feelings and behaviour. She's trying to reframe things in a more realistic or positive way. She's been cutting less, although that hasn't been our main focus. Our focus has been on helping her to learn new ways to deal with stress. Feelings of anger, sadness, hopelessness and shame are hard for anyone to get a handle on. But she's begun to express some of this using words rather than relying on cutting herself. Knowing that she can ask for help when she needs it is a really important thing that she's learned.
When we hang out, we just like doing ordinary things and putting the other stuff aside for a while. We also have this deal that if I'm worried about her, I can talk to her mum.
It's a bit weird not to be cutting. I mean, sometimes it's really hard. But the more I manage without doing it, the better I feel. And my scars, they are a part of me. And when I look at them, they remind me of how far I've come.
Young people who deliberately hurt themselves don't necessarily want to die, but it can become a way in which they cope with distress or overwhelming negative feelings, thoughts or memories. Some stresses that might trigger self-harm include difficulties with family or close friends, school or work problems, depression, alcohol and drug use, grief, trauma or abuse. People who self-harm don't need to work it out alone. Finding someone to talk to, a local doctor, counsellor, Headspace or eHeadspace, or a confidential helpline is a great place to start. Self-harm might be a way to cope for a while, but in time it is important to learn to manage difficult feelings and cope with stress in much healthier ways. If someone is thinking about suicide, they need to get help straight away. A local hospital knows how to help.
We hope that you found that question and answer session really helpful, and the video from Headspace as well. It's certainly great to just have your combined knowledge to be able to unpack that topic, Jo. I do have a couple of questions for you. Firstly, what would you say to a parent or a carer who is really quite worried about how others may react around them, and as a result feel quite reluctant to actually reach out for help about their young person who's self-harming, Jo?
Yeah, I guess it wasn't really explicit in the question and answer we had, and I'm glad you asked that question. So I think the biggest thing, and I appreciate what it's like in a country town too, where lots of people might want to know other people's business and that kind of thing. So there might be some reluctance there, but I think anyone going to see a health professional like a GP, a counsellor, a psychologist is of course always going to keep that confidential. And I think it's really important for people to understand there's just no judgment there. I certainly have had a number of people that I've supported, so parents, grandparents sometimes, aunts and uncles, who have had a young person in their life doing that. And I think the mum said that once, it was out in the open, there was a sense of relief, and that young person was able to talk to a mum. So I think that's really important, is to keep that relationship there, but also you need someone for yourself. So whether it's a trusted friend, a relative, or whether it's someone like me, it's going to be confidential for sure. And I think the earlier that people do that, the better. So being, I think, proactive about it, because, problem shared is a problem halved, is that sort of, saying, and I truly believe that, I think. And then, we can put some strategies in place that maybe people are already doing, or maybe they're things that they haven't thought of as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so that early action is key. And you certainly don't want to wait until it's at a crisis point, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Another question for you. At one point in our session, you mentioned about helping to find coping strategies for the actual person who is self-harming. And so I'm just wondering what strategies you might suggest would be helpful.
Yeah, and that can look so different depending on who it is. So, their age and what's going on for them and that kind of thing. But what we know, and this is for anybody facing some difficulties, is that all the basics that we hear about all the time in the media, and certainly has been researched. So getting good sleep is really important for young people. Having they call it sleep hygiene, so having a really good sleep routine. So that might be things, for example, and everyone's different, getting off devices, having a calm sort of, home, maybe having a warm bath or a shower, warm drink, having, the bedroom space comfortable, having some quiet and a darkness as well. Things like having, rather than saying diet, I like to talk about good food. So good quality food that really nourishes our bodies, which is what we really need when things are really, not going great. And when I say exercise, I don't mean, doing marathons, but just some movement and, doing something that the young person likes. So it could be kicking a football around with dad or mum, or going for a horse ride, or, walking along the creek and that kind of thing. So whatever it is that person really appreciates. Some people love writing their ideas down in like a journal. That's not something that I like doing myself. But, something I like to do is take my dog for a walk, in bushland and that kind of thing. So mums and dads and grandparents and aunts and uncles are pretty good at knowing what the young person really enjoys. So and I think that video showed us that too with the young girl, getting them back into just the normal things they enjoy, like going to a movie or whatever it is that they really enjoy. And I think I don't like to call them replacement behaviours, but some young people they might be sort of chewing their nails down to the quick, so they might have like a ring. You can get lots of things where they can, if they're a little bit anxious, just using that, or a little band or a bangle, or it could just be a piece of cloth or something, just reminds them that they're loved and something that they can use instead of cutting, potentially.
Yeah. So almost a distraction, if you like, as well.
Yeah. Or a reminder, distraction reminder. Yeah. Who they are and that they're loved. Yeah.
That's great. And then I guess another question which we probably didn't touch on is what sort of conversations might you have with siblings of a young person who's self-harming? So, how do you explain it to others in the family, and would that depend on what the young person actually wants as well? What's your advice there, Jo?
Yeah, I think it's really important, because that young person that's experiencing and doing self-harm, often for whatever reason, there's lots of reasons, as we know, why someone might self-harm, maybe feel powerless. And so I think if there's a parent or a grandparent, whoever is the main carer, might have that open and transparent conversation with the young person and just say, look, your brothers and sisters have noticed things are different. They might be sensing attention, and the brothers and sisters may be older or younger. So it would be important to just discuss that with the young person that's self-harming, about how that conversation might go. And the young person might even want to talk with their brothers and sisters, with the parent, grandparent, whoever there. And I think it definitely needs to be age appropriate.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And some people, some families operate very differently. So some are very open with, this is the way we are in our family. We share everything and we talk about things. And then other families might feel like that's not okay in our family. We don't do those things. So people have a good sense of what's going on in their family. But what I often think about, and this is the same for any kind of difficulty or challenge in the family, is that often where there's one person in the family facing something, often, and I'm a parent and you're a parent, we can sometimes forget about the other siblings and our other children in this equation. And chances are, if things are getting tricky at home, they're going to know. They've either heard the conversations that are going on, or they've seen or heard things going on, or they get a sense of maybe the tension. And the things that aren't being said. So, some careful discussion about that. And again, you might be able to talk with someone else that's gone through that kind of thing themselves, or, maybe you're talking with someone like myself or a psychologist. GP might be useful about how you might have that conversation. But I know there are resources online that can help you work through those things as well. Yeah, but they're important. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually really important to consider, I think, Louise.
Yeah, it certainly needs. And it's something that you can unpack with someone you're actually getting support from in that space as well. As a parent.
Well, one person, regardless of what it is, has a ripple effect in a family. So, we'll make sure everyone's doing okay.
Absolutely, definitely. And you mentioned resources, and that sort of follows on to something else I just wanted to mention, because there's certainly an awful lot of resources available to us on the internet on this topic, and it can actually be quite overwhelming to know quite what to look at and where to turn. So what's your advice in that space?
Yeah, you're right, Louise. There's so many things, and we don't know if they're right or wrong. So and there really isn't a right or wrong, but we've got some really good resources out there that are evidence-based, well researched, well used, and we've got those up on the slide as well. But I think it's important to think of some target contacts that are available 24/7, because we know, for example, in Baku, we don't really have access to a large hospital, and there's no ambulance there that can get there quickly. So it might just be that you want to talk with someone, I'm not sure what to do, while you're calling an ambulance or while you're thinking about transport for a young person, or it might not even be at that point where you just want to have someone to talk with. So there's Lifeline, there's 24/7. I really like Parent Line. I think they're not quite 24/7, but their hours are pretty great. So they're there just for parents and or carers, so if you're grandparent. They also have Kids Helpline as well, which is great. And then there's other places like Sane, and there's some online apps again, which is like Compass, which is on the slide that we've got as well. But there's a lot out there. We've also got some links, I think, as well, to some resources that might be really helpful for people, just if they want to, because we've given a lot of information tonight. And so, you know, if people just wanted to learn a little bit more, or they might be concerned about someone, there's some links that they can go to where they can just sort of read at their leisure as well. Yeah, and handy tips and things like that too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful, isn't it, to just help process some of what you've heard today?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, I think that's it. I don't think there's any other questions to ask you. So I guess it's a big thank you to everyone for joining us in this session today. We know it's a complex issue, but we really hope that this has been a really helpful starting point for you to better understand self-harm. And I guess it's also important just to flag again, if you or a friend do need any help, please don't hesitate to reach out for support for a confidential conversation from a professional. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise.